I just got done watching Manhunt. It's a 6-episode series on Apple Plus that tells the story of John Wilkes Booth, the search for him. And I was not aware of the work of the Secretary of War following Abraham Lincoln's assassination in order to search and find him. And I learned history as I watched it. It's fiction, but there's enough history there, and I think we can always learn quite a bit more. Manhunt. Since the beginning of this year, we have been focusing on the theme, good news, great joy, all people. And this has been based on the Gospel of Luke, which is where the angels obviously announce that Jesus' birth is good news of great joy for all people. Including today, and for 3 Sundays, all of our readings are going to come from Luke chapter 7. And a few years ago, I remember doing a sermon series that I called Stories They Don't Teach You in Sunday School. And I mention this because this, Luke's version of this story is not a version that we usually tell in Sunday school or in worship. Now, the passages you heard includes 2 healing stories, the story of the healing of the Roman centurion's servant and the resurrection of the widow of Nain's son. And if those stories do sound familiar to you, it's because you heard the version from Matthew 8, not the version from Luke. In Matthew's version, when Jesus enters into the city of Capernaum, quote, a centurion came to him, to Jesus, appealing to him and saying, Lord, my servant is lying at home in terrible distress. And Jesus said to him, I will come and cure him. So in Matthew, the centurion interacts directly with Jesus. But in Luke, Jesus never has direct contact with the centurion. And that's a pretty big difference. Both versions cannot be factually correct, and that's why Matthew's version is the one that we are more familiar with, most likely because it works better artistically if the Roman centurion interacts directly with Jesus, rather than, as Luke tells it, the Jewish elders are talking to Jesus. One more thing here, John 4 actually tells another version of this story. Only in John, it's told this way, there was a royal official whose son lay ill in Capernaum. When he heard that Jesus had come up from Judea to Galilee, he went and begged him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. So in John's version, instead of a Roman centurion, it's a royal official, and instead of a paralyzed servant, it's a son who is on death's door. Now, if you're curious, the Gospel of Mark does not tell us any version of this story, which is curious because Mark is the first gospel that was written. But again, Matthew, Luke, and John all tell us a similar story with significant discrepancies, which is why we're less familiar with Luke's version. And of the 3, I would say that Luke's version is potentially the most scandalous version. And don't get me wrong, I mean, the versions in both Matthew and Luke are more scandalous than the version in John, because in Matthew and Luke, Jesus is coming to the aid of someone who is not Jewish. And worse, it's a Roman military officer. And so the centurion is quite literally the enemy. So Luke is revealing yet again how Jesus is fulfilling the angelic prophecy, that he is good news of great joy for all people, even enemies. Not only that, but the events described in Luke 7 follow what is called the Sermon on the Plain from Luke 6. Not the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Plain, where Jesus has just taught his followers that they are to love their enemies, that they are to be non-judgmental, and that true faith produces good fruit. And so, right after that, in Luke 7, Jesus quickly reveals that he is just not talking the talk. He's walking the walk. Now, the inclusion of the Jewish elders is one reason I think that Luke's version of this story is more scandalous. Because what that is telling us is that the Jewish elders, these are religious folk, and not just Jesus, are cooperating with a Roman enemy, who the Israelites rightly consider foreign occupiers of their land. So in Luke's story, Jesus is cooperating with Jewish elders whose loyalty and patriotism is already suspect, which then makes Jesus's patriotism suspect. And these elders appear all too happy to advocate on behalf of this centurion, telling Jesus he is worthy of having you do this for him, for he loves our people, and it is he who built our synagogue for us. In other words, these Jewish elders are telling Jesus that the centurion, though a foreigner and an enemy, is nonetheless qualified to receive mercy because of what he's done. Now the script then flips as the centurion, we are told, sends another group of friends to pass along another message while Jesus is on the way, that Jesus should not come into his house because of his own, the centurion's own sense of unworthiness. So in contrast to the Jewish elders, the centurion sends his friends to tell Jesus that he, the centurion, is not qualified to receive Jesus into his household. And one scholar points out that this is a reversal of perspectives because Jesus has already demonstrated that he's willing to enter into Gentile homes. And yet, what's going on here is that the centurion is demonstrating sensitivity, cultural sensitivity, because he knows that Jesus, as an observant religious Jew, will become unclean the moment he enters into the centurion's household. Further, the centurion has his friends convey the point that it is not his own qualifications that matter, but Jesus's qualifications. Simply say the word and cure his servant. And that's what's happened. Because when the friends arrive back at the house, the servant has been restored to health. So this leaves me pondering the question: what, if anything, qualifies the servant to be healed by Jesus. Even though the story actually revolves around the servant who is in need of healing, there's nothing to suggest that this servant has any type of faith in Jesus. And if we've missed that point, then the very next story tells us about a dead son who Jesus restores to life. And it's a great story for another time, but notice that unlike the centurion, the mother of the dead son, and certainly the dead son, does not ask for Jesus' assistance in any way, shape, or form. As verse 13 indicates, Jesus is simply moved by compassion as this funeral procession draws near. A few weeks ago, I said that if you are in the vicinity of Jesus, you're going to get forgiven whether you ask for it or not. And here it seems that when you are in the vicinity of Jesus, you're going to get healed whether you ask for it or not. Wait, don't we personally have to believe in order to receive? Don't we at least have to say yes to qualify for God's mercy and grace? Well, friends, I don't know exactly what to say because that's not how it happens in Luke 7, 1 through 17. What is clear is that the most conservative reading of these two stories reveals how the centurion servant and the widow's son are totally unqualified to receive the mercy Jesus demonstrates. They do nothing except stand in need of mercy. And in this we see again that the Roman centurion has conveyed what he's conveyed to his friends, that they're all totally unqualified. The Apostle Paul writes, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is a gift. It is a gift. It is a gift from God. Not the result of works or ingenuity, so that no one may boast." That's why we baptize infants in a Methodist church. Because well before they can say or do anything, God's mercy is upon them. But there's one more thing I think that is worth noting in this story, and that is, remember that the Jewish elders come to Jesus seeking help not for themselves, but on behalf of the centurion. And then remember that the centurion's friends come to Jesus not on their own behalf, but on behalf of another. And of course, the story is of the centurion who is seeking help not for himself, but on behalf of another human being who stands in need of mercy. Friends, how can we not automatically think of that courageous bishop, Marion Edgar Booty, who stood in front of our president and asked him to demonstrate mercy and compassion on behalf of immigrants and LGBTQIA plus persons and trans persons, even though she herself is none of those things. I would suggest that we need to keep two things in mind about these stories. Number one, we do well to remember that our healing, our salvation, God's gift of grace rests upon no qualification that we have, not one. And this means that those that we might deem to be unqualified for mercy are nonetheless potential recipients of the grace and healing of Jesus, because that is what Jesus does. And second, our faith is at its best when it is not self-interested and self-seeking, but rather when we act on behalf of others who simply need mercy and grace. And you know, it seems to me from this story that the more unqualified, the better. Amen.